Hey everyone, we wanted to share a few thoughts with you guys for a few moments on what we're calling pandemic marriage. The last several months have been like no other, at least in my memory, both in terms of life and how the effects of the pandemic on just every aspect, including marriage. And so, as church leaders, really wanted to take the time to kind of lean in on this for with you guys and discuss kind of, hey, what are some things maybe that we're experiencing, going through, and how are we dealing with them in our marriages, because we want to continue to glorify God in all that we do. And so certainly this is we're not going to be able to cover everything possible. I'm sure you've got a lot of experiences that you've been going through. We're hoping to kind of touch on a few, maybe things that we've experienced ourselves, things we've heard in conversations that hopefully will encourage you and help you and strengthen you as you strive to build a marriage that pleases God. So, pandemic, obviously everything is thrown completely out of whack.
Yeah, when that happens, it brings a lot of stress, right? Stress with work, with school, with the kids now being back in school, not really back in school. Church, just the rhythm of life is all messed up and out of whack. And so that affects, I think, often, so many things in our lives, but responsibilities are in a sense redefined in the home because, sometimes in some cases both spouses are home now and working from home, or working from home in the sense that they're helping the kids with school and still trying to get all the housework done and everything else, and needing help from one another can be stressful, and especially if we're not vocal about our expectations or our needs or things like that. So responsibilities being redefined can bring stress. I think about maybe feeling like our spouse isn't doing their fair share or doing enough. I've had a few conversations like this where people just, again, being thrown into something completely different, something we've never experienced before, and the same roles and responsibilities don't quite fit into the pandemic life. And so sometimes that brings stress. And when we're stressed, then sometimes we have coping skills that aren't really helpful or healthy, and we can turn to those things instead of really dealing it in a healthy way, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, pandemic, of course, has brought out differences of opinions, even in terms of the pandemic itself. How we respond to that. In some cases, I've talked to some families where the husband and a wife are on completely different pages in terms of what they expect or anticipate, or how they view masks or being out in public, or just the different things that come along with the pandemic and how they view it. I know early on, I don't know that Ange and I were completely on the same page early on. I think we've gotten much closer. But I tend to be more, I speak my mind freely. Some of you may know that. And I found myself saying a lot of things that were very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Passionately spoken out?
I spoke passionately about my thoughts and irritations with the pandemic. A lot was just frustration, but I realized that even the way that I was speaking about it was causing trouble just between us, and so we had to kind of get on the same page, and I had to kind of dial it back. And so we'll talk again about that in a few minutes. But differences of opinion brings out some different challenges during the pandemic. The other thing that seems to be happening a lot of is just the blurry lines between work and home.
Yeah.
When you work, many of us work from home, not all of us, but many of us work from home. And when you work from home, begin working from home, it causes all kinds of strange little changes to rhythms of life, how we do things. In some respects, causes even more stress in our marriages. You're being interrupted a lot, perhaps more than you normally would be at work. Or perhaps there's you no longer have a commute time to kind of decompress after work, before you get home, to kind of switch from work mode into dad mode, or to mom mode, or into husband or wife mode. And so you're kind of you walk out of one room into another, and you're on. And so that's a change for many of us. And so I think that and even just learning how to disconnect from work when it's time to stop working, and then spend time with family and be there for your family is also, the lines get blurry. So these are some of the challenges. I know there's many others, but these are some of the things that we wanted to kind of lean into and address, and talk about some keys to navigating these challenges during this time of pandemic. The first thing we want to talk about is just the idea of having good and clear boundaries. Now, I looked this up in the dictionary, and a boundary is defined as a limit of a subject or sphere of activity. And I like that definition because what it implies is simply that we have many spheres of activity in our lives, spheres of relationships, spheres of activities. And so having clearly defined limits of those spheres are very important. And those are, the big challenge we have, I think, now is in many ways is that those spheres have been sort of compressed and mushed and smashed together. And so we need to kind of redefine those boundaries.
And I think, first of all, it really starts off with our relationship with God. I think if we don't have good boundaries with work, sleep, things like this, then that can bleed into our relationship with God, and we we look at our schedules and we think, I don't have time with God. And yet, I know for myself, in a time like this, I need more time with God. I need more time to go to Him and talk to Him about how I'm feeling. And I'm so grateful for 4K40 because that's given me more of a push and more of an incentive to get out and to pray. But I know that I need that time with God because it is such a tumultuous time, and I need to be able to bring my fears and my anxieties and my worries and my thoughts and all those things to Him. But again, I think we need to have really great boundaries with going to bed on time so that we're able to get up and spend time with God, or that we have boundaries with our job, like, okay, it ends at this particular time and I'm not going to get back on again in the morning until I've spent time with God. Just boundaries in all those different areas, boundaries with social media, all those kinds of things, making sure that there are limits to them so that we make sure that we spend time with God. And I think about Jesus in Mark 1, verse 35. It says, "And rising very early in the morning while it was still dark, He departed and went out to a desolate place, and there He prayed." And Jesus was pressed on all sides all the time throughout the New Testament with His time, with people wanting His attention. Yet He created boundaries with His disciples, with the people around Him that needed things from Him, so that He made sure He spent time with God. And I know that's so important for us to do. And I pray that we don't stop that during this pandemic, that we draw even closer to Him.
Yeah, and I think about boundaries. Obviously that's the first one. I think another one very clearly has to do with just our work and home boundaries. Where work ends and where home begins, and vice versa. I think this is a big challenge, especially for those of us that work at home. Although, even if you go travel to work and come back, still that becomes a challenge. It can be a challenge for us, even just mentally, and kind of how we live our lives. And so I think having designated workspace in your home, a place where, okay, this is work time. It's kind of funny. We, because doing what we do a lot of, these days it seems like I record a lot of things, and a lot of
Zoom calls.
A lot of Zoom calls, a lot of recordings, things like this, and so Angela, of course, very creatively discovered at the beginning of all this that we were interrupting each other a lot at the wrong times, and if somebody walks in the room when you're recording, that's just that's no bueno. Or if you're on a Zoom call, etc. So she made these little "Do Not Disturb" signs to put on the doors whenever any of us were recording, and which is just about every day, between the two of us, and then Savannah doing worship things, and for San Antonio Church and things like that. We're always recording something, and so it was just one small way to kind of designate boundaries for our workspace. You all are going to have similar types of situations you're going to have to figure out boundaries for. But setting those, it kept us from a lot of fights, actually. I think that little door hanger. Another way, though, in boundaries is just shutting it down when it's time to shut down. I think some of us have very demanding jobs. Some of you, your jobs became more demanding after COVID hit, and some of you perhaps maybe a little less. But the demands of your work certainly don't supersede the demands and needs of your family. And when the lines get blurry and there's not clear boundaries, it's difficult to shut that off. And what ends up happening is we end up hurting our families because we're not shutting it down. It's one of the things I learned when I was doing some of my doctoral, or not my doctoral work, but my master's work especially. It was very hard to shut my mind off. In fact, I would try to read and cram work into every small pocket of time that I had throughout the day.
Which is why I just loved his master's program.
Yes, she told me frequently how much she loved the school. And so, I learned actually from that experience, though, that, so when I got around doing my doctorate, and again, time demands were very high. I was able to, I think in a better way, be able to shut down. Even though I had more to do, I was diligent about shutting it down at certain times so that I could be with the family. And I think that's very important, especially when you're working from home. Another for you, I know it is for me. We find ourselves working a lot more now in a pandemic than we do even normally, and just needing that mental space and that break. I mean, God created us with a need for rest. I mean, He Himself took a break after creating the world, created in 6 days, and then He needed a break on the seventh day. And that concept He is extended to us as a grace, I believe, because we need it. And they call that Sabbath in the Old Testament. In Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Not some kind of rule that we have to follow. It's actually something that God created and gave us. It's a gift. And we need to take that. We need it. And so having a time each week set aside where you just shut everything off. Just, hey, let's just unplug, get away. I'm not going to engage in work things. I'm just going to rest in the Lord. Is such an incredible part of our spiritual lives, and certainly very important for our marriages and for our families. I think another thing, just figuring out, in terms of boundaries, is figuring out healthy protocols for how you're going to deal with COVID, and having that being a regular conversation. Every day seems to change what's recommended. Every day seems to change what's what seems to be dangerous, what's not dangerous, it's hard to keep up. But the important thing is that we are on the same page, and in your marriages you're on the same page. Even if you don't necessarily agree fully with one another, at least that you've talked about it and have some compromise. In Philippians 2, verse 3, it says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others."
Yeah, I think this is really important. Again, I've had many different conversations, and I know there are lots of couples out there where they differ on exactly how to handle the pandemic, exactly where they should go, who they should be meeting with, how they should do this. And I think it's super important that we consider one another above ourselves in thinking about these things and being willing to compromise. If you're the spouse who really needs that time with people, really needs to get out, really needs to, you're an extrovert and you just really need people, it's important for the spouse who maybe feels like is more cautious and wants to be home. I think it's important for the spouse who wants to be home to listen to the needs of the extrovert, or the person who, it doesn't necessarily have to be an extrovert, or the person who really feels the need to be with people. I really feel like it's important for the spouse who wants to stay home to really listen to those needs, because those are real needs. The spiritual, the emotional connection with people is real. At the same time, for those who feel like they need to be at home and they need to make sure that masks are worn everywhere and all of that kind of stuff, the person who wants to go out more needs to listen to that person's concerns. And if they are out, do what their spouse asks them to, whether it be wear a mask or stay 6 feet away. But I think there needs to be compromises on both parts, because there's a safety need for one, there's a need to be with people for the other, and I think those are equally important. And it's really important that we have calm conversations where we're really listening to one another and really trying to understand the other person's perspective and doing all that we can to be able to meet each other's needs in that area. Which leads us to the next point, is about communication.
Yeah, relationship is the key here. It's more important than being right, and that's an important thing to remember for all of us. I mean, I know I have to remember that, because I do like to be right, and sometimes I can sort of push really hard on my opinions, and I've had to I'm still learning. Can't say that in the past tense. I am still learning to dial that back, because really what's most important is my relationship with Angela, and so we have to be able to talk these things through, even if I have strong opinions, and even if she has strong opinions, and be able to hear each other out and have compassion and concern for one another and for each other's needs, which, as Angela said, leads to empathetic communication. Is kind of our second big point here, if you're keeping track. To be able to communicate empathetically, we've got to understand our spouse's perspective. Colossians 4, verse 6 says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." And when I think about answering and communicating empathetically, to be able to do that, you have to know what that person thinks. I can't respond to her needs if I don't know what her needs are. Otherwise, I'm just pontificating my own thoughts without regards for her, and that usually leads to a pretty healthy disagreement at the very least. And so I would encourage you to set aside time to hear each other out. Because, during a time like this, it's interesting. We all sort of tend to weave in and out of our feelings about COVID, about the changes that's brought to our lives. And we all have different thoughts. There are some days where I'm just happy as pie and doing fine and busy and feeling like, hey, life is good. And there are days that I feel like I hit the fan. I'm just like, I'm done. I'm tired. I hate this. I want to quit. What island can I move to where I can be free and not have to think about this stuff? And, and usually those days for me don't line up with the days for Angela. And so we tend to kind of ping pong back and forth,
or our kids,
or in the kid, you throw the kids in the mix, and so everybody's having their day. We have all had our days, and not just one, many throughout this entire thing, and almost never do they all happen at the same time.
Probably a good thing.
Which is it probably is a good thing. But I think it does help to be able to set aside time where you're communicating, where you can express how you're feeling. And let that be a time to sort of, so that it's not something that's an ongoing, all the time kind of conversation, but where, hey, let's set aside time to be able to talk and express what's going on. We all need that safe space to be able to talk about it, and certainly marriage should be the most sacred of safe places to be able to talk about what we're really thinking, what we're really feeling. But to do that, we have to be empathetic. Proverbs 10 verse 13 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and his shame. And certainly we want to, we've got to make sure that we're hearing one another. And so Ange's going to share a few practicals on that.
And these are nothing you guys haven't heard before, but it's so good to be reminded. It's good for me to remember myself. I mean, I think, we need to make sure that we're not assuming we know exactly what the other person is thinking. This happens so often in our marriage, and I think those of us who've married, especially I think for those of us who've been married for a long time, you already think, I know that person, I know what they're thinking, I know what he's thinking, I see that look on his face, I know that tone. And we think we know exactly what the other person's thinking, and we don't. And so really the simple thing is just to ask, what are you thinking? How are you feeling? Those simple things are really important. And being able in turn then to respond vulnerably, well, this is what I'm thinking, and this is what I'm feeling. And if it's in relation to maybe a bump or an argument or something that you're going through with your spouse, I think remembering, the 3 points of vulnerability when we are talking to one another, especially again, if it is an argument or something like that, it's what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Or how do I feel about whatever happened? What is my weakness in that? Like in what way am I feeling weak in this situation? And then what do I need from you? Those things are so important, and I think it can really de-escalate an argument and really help us to listen empathetically to one another when we remember those things. I think, again, having empathy with one another, asking those questions is so important. And if somebody doesn't know, I know it's a question we ask in our house, how are you feeling about things? And sometimes we don't know. Dave, when we first got married, had like 2 emotions, anger and happiness. And so I would have to...
That's still kind of true.
I would have to ask him, okay, so are you... And he was like, I don't know how I feel. Okay, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you frustrated? Or, you can find all kinds of charts on the internet with different emotions. And sometimes we just need to take out the chart and go, okay, which one are you? Whether it's our spouse. I know we're not talking about kids, but I think it is important to do that with our children in a time like this. But just asking, hey, help me to identify how you're feeling so we can talk about this. And we can help one another and encourage one another in the way that's needed. We just need to make sure that we take time to listen. I know life is so busy, and again, work and school and home and everything's blurred, but we really need to make sure that we are taking the time to listen to one another.
Yeah, talking is the most dangerous thing people can do when they're stressed, which I thought was kind of funny. This is a quote I saw. And listening is the most infrequent thing they do when they're stressed. So, when we get stressed, oftentimes we want to lean in and kind of press our own opinions and our own thoughts instead of really taking the time to listen and draw out the thoughts of the other person. Now, I recognize that if you both take that approach, then no one's going to talk. But you can take turns and allow each other the space to be able to express what you're saying. And so this empathetic listening is so important, which leads to the third practical thing that we want to talk about, and that's just simply having grace.
Amen.
Lots of grace. 1 Peter 4 verse 8 says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. And then in Matthew 6 verse 12, Jesus in the Lord's Prayer says, ask for God to forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors, or forgive us our transgressions as we have forgiven those who have transgressed against us. And you think about that, and certainly we have received so much grace from God, personally, individually, collectively. And so when we understand God's nature and the grace that He extends to us, even when we're just, being crazy, we can extend that same grace to one another. And this is such a crazy time. Everything is new. Everything's different. We're all figuring it out. I feel like some of you may have seen about a month ago, I put a post on the Facebook page. There was a funny picture of this, or a video of this bus that was on this narrow road that was on a dam where it dropped off both sides, and the guy's trying to do a 3-point turn. It ended up being like a 59-point turn, trying to turn this bus around. And that's exactly what it said. I think the caption was, how pastors feel during a pandemic, and that's certainly how I feel. I think we probably all feel that. We can all relate to that. It's like every day something different. Things are changing, and it's a struggle to get it right. But we have to have grace for ourselves, and grace for one another, and grace towards each other. And I think I would just encourage us there, let's just have lots of grace for one another in our marriages, in the church, for our kids. We're all figuring this thing out. And then the last thing is simply just to remember to get help.
Right. I think it's so important for us to remember we have a great support system in the kingdom. We are so grateful to have all the different couples and people around us in our lives that we can talk to, that we are bumping or fighting or whatever, that we can go to and get help from. I think sometimes we forget, though, that we have this, and we need to use the resources that God has given us. We have a great church family, and we need to make sure we make those phone calls and talk about what's going on, that we don't just, all of our problems don't stay behind closed doors, and we don't get the help that we need, or we only get the help that we need when we're in a giant crisis. Let's get the help along the way, to get some advice along the way, pray with another couple, do something. The resources are out there. And I did want to remind us also that if you are having mental health issues, mental health challenges, please let us know. The church has resources. We have counselors we can suggest to you, and the church will help you pay for the first session, and then talk about, how to proceed later on. But we really want to make sure, I know we've made that announcement several months ago, that offer is still open. If you are having mental health challenges, please let us know. Please let Dave or I know, or the elders know, so we can get you the help that you need. But the help is out there, and I love Galatians 6:2. It says, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. We're all feeling it, as we've said, and so we can all be there for one another and help one another in our marriages. Let's just use the resources that God gave us.
Yeah, I think sometimes what happens is we think, I don't want to burden anybody. I don't want to bother anybody with my problems. But think about it this way. We all want to fulfill the Word of God.
That's right.
And so by not sharing, you're robbing somebody of the opportunity of bearing your burden and helping you. And don't do that. You need it. We all need it. It actually helps me when I'm helping somebody else. It's equally, just as much as when I need help from someone. And that's the nature of the church fellowship, the nature of the body of Christ. And so, let's lean into that. Let's make sure that we're, really giving the attention to our marriages and our families that we need to during this time. It seems almost counterintuitive. Hey, we're around each other more than we've ever been. But yet sometimes being around each other more than ever, we can still feel more separate than ever if we are not deliberate. And so it's really not circumstantial. It's not pandemic, non-pandemic, normal life, not normal life. It's really about being deliberate about in building our relationships. And so we want to encourage you to continue to do that. And obviously, we're having to navigate some interesting challenges with the pandemic. But ultimately, our goal is to build a great marriage that honors and glorifies God. We love you guys. Hope these thoughts help. And take some time to discuss them in your small groups, in your discipleship times. Or perhaps if you're watching this with a group now, you guys can talk about these things as we're done. We love you guys.
Bye.